Harper's Kennel of Stella, Missouri is proud to be sponsoring this portion of broadcasting on KNEO. Owned by Judy and Danny Harper, Harper's Kennel of Stella, Missouri specializes in French Bulldogs. For more information, the phone number is 417-628-3083.
Welcome to Crosspoint. An interactive program featuring ministers and leaders of the Christian community addressing the issues that are challenging the church today. Here's your host, Mark Taylor.
Bible prophecy is unfolding all the time, and now we have a true red heifer for the rebuilding of the third temple. What does this mean? This is Mark Taylor. Welcome to today's Crosspoint. My guest today is Mondo Gonzales. He's going to bring to us some of the updated information and insight into what does this mean in his latest book, The Red Heifer Ritual, which will help us understand the significance of this in our own time. And folks, welcome to today's Crosspoint. Today with me, I've got Mondo Gonzales, and as I said, we're going to be talking about the Red Heifer Ritual. And you hear Mondo along with Gary Spearman and others here on Prophecy Watchers each week as we have that program on. And so, Mondo, it's good that you've been able to take a little time. I know you stay pretty busy traveling and everything. And this is a real interesting thing. I've always heard the story of the Red Heifer. The Red Heifer had to be back for the final part of the temple. And so now that's might be getting a little bit closer than ever before. And you call it the last piece of the third temple puzzle. Why do you call it the last piece of the third temple?
You know, when we, going back all the way to Israel's founding in 1948, there, even from the beginning, there were those that, those more in the religious camp, very much so, because Israel is 80% secular, so there's not a lot of enthusiasm among the secular people, but the religious have thought about the rebuilt temple for 2,000 years. It's part of their Passover ceremony. They would always say, next year in Jerusalem, next year in Jerusalem. And so when 48 came, and then certainly in 1967, when they gained control of the old city, immediately after that, several religious Jews had founded some, like, for example, the Temple Mount Faithful group. And their goal was, okay, now that we have control of the Temple Mount, we will build a temple. And so the fascinating thing about it is they began to develop, and people can go to the Temple Institute, whether online or even in person today, and they've developed everything they need for the building of the temple: the priest's clothing, the golden menorah, the golden altar of incense, the golden table of showbread, all the other harps for music, and the other copper vessels that they need to perform the water libations and other things. So it's fascinating that they have everything they need except for one thing, and it's the red heifer, which is used to purify not only the people but also the location. So that's why I say it's the last piece, because they have everything else they need. They're just waiting, and they've been looking archaeologically even for the ashes of the red heifer, which have been hard. They don't know if they're ever going to find that, which is why they attempted to start their breeding program or to be looking for a new red heifer.
Okay, so from what I understand, they believe they've found not one but several of these red heifers. And where did they find them at, and how most likely are they are really red heifers?
So back in the 80s, in the 1980s, they began to look. And, of course, they wanted, their ideal situation would be to find one in the land of Israel. But Israel's not known for its, big cattle ranches and everything else. And so what they did, even going into the 90s, is one of the first ones they found was in Mississippi, a rancher by the name of Clyde Lott. And so the rabbi, one of the chief rabbis of the Temple Institute, Chaim Richman, he came to Mississippi, looked at it, was like, oh, this looks like a good one. But then, as was typical, as the cows get older, they become disqualified. And so, in the 90s, there was a few more, 2000s, a few more. But the reason why things are a little bit different now is in 2022, they brought over, they purchased 5 from Texas. And they brought 5 over in a bunch, in a group. And that really changed, I think, everybody's perspective, because not only did they have these 5, at least from a preliminarily a qualification. They had 15, 16 more. And so what you have now is throughout Texas and other places, you have ranchers who are breeding these red Angus cows in the hopes of, selling good beef, but also if they qualify that they could be used by the Jews in Israel. So, and not only that, but the ones that they have now that were flown over in September of 22, they flew over 5. 3 have become disqualified, again, which is not surprising. But those 3, they're still very good cows. They just grew some extra hairs that were not red. So now what they're going to do is they'll take those cows and just put them in their own Israeli breeding program. So that's the fascinating thing about it, is primarily in Texas, but Israel has their own breeding program now, which is exciting for them.
We know, hearing about the red heifer, but why does, I guess it has to be red, the red heifer has to be red because that's what the standards were according to the priest and everything. This is going back to the Old Testament. But is there also a certain age that this heifer, of course a heifer doesn't mean a cow, it means a heifer. So do they have to be a certain age of a heifer?
Yes. What you have in Jewish thinking is it's a little bit different than us maybe as Christians, where as Christians, our standard or our book is the Bible. Well, of course, the Jewish people believe in the Bible, the Old Testament, but they also have other writings, the Jewish traditions, which have been written down around 200 AD in the Mishnah, and that's one. And then they also have some other writings that they wrote down in the Talmud about 500 to 600, AD. So for them, we go to the Book of Numbers, and it says there, as you mentioned, it has to be a heifer. An eglah is the Hebrew word for calf. So it doesn't use that, and it doesn't use the word for bull. So it's a female cow, and it says they're red. It has to be a red heifer. And so, of course, in their writings, where it's not specific in the Bible about how old it has to be, in the traditions, they spent a lot of time talking about how old. And the consensus that they came to, which is typical in rabbinic writings, they'll often say, well, Rabbi Jeremiah says this, and Rabbi Ishmael says this, and all these different rabbis give their opinions. But the current opinion, which is the consensus, is that the cow has to be in its 3rd year, and for us that's not 36 months. That's for them, it's in its 3rd year, so it's 2 years and 1 month old. So as soon as that cow reaches 2 years and 1 month old, if it's still red and it doesn't have any blemishes on it, it's never been used to work, it's never been pregnant, then it can qualify according to not only the Bible, but according to the Jewish traditions as well.
Now, and I know you've wrote about this in Prophecy Watchers magazine. I've read some of those, but here in the book, right on page 5, you say prophecy is most often a snapshot of circumstances in particular time and place. The prophet is given a word or a dream or a vision of a time period, and when it comes to understanding why the Prophecy Watchers expect a 3rd temple, we see a snapshot into the future by several different prophets. So not just one prophet, but several have talked about the need for this to happen and this 3rd temple.
Oh, absolutely. You have, the reason I said the snapshot is because the Bible, when it speaks about prophecy, it doesn't always give us, exactly how it occurs. It just tells us at this moment in time you see this. And so in the Bible, several prophets, Daniel, Jesus, Paul, and John all spoke that in the future there's going to be this temple that is in operation. And it doesn't tell us how it gets there. It doesn't tell us the process. We just know that there's a point in time when the temple is in existence and it's offering sacrifices, because we know in Daniel 9:27 that the Antichrist figure comes in and stops the sacrifices from happening. And so what we do, at least when you interpret the Bible this way, you go, okay, well, it looks like there's a temple there. Again, we have 4 different witnesses of this temple being there. And we look and we say, okay, what we do now, what we get to do is we get to watch all this process happen, which is actually kind of fun, because we know the end result, but we just don't know exactly all the details of how it happens. And so as we see these progressions, we go, oh, look at that. And so it's actually really exciting to watch it progress because we know the final outcome.
Now, in the book here on page 19, You said this is a very serious situation, why God has created the ceremony to produce the red heifer ashes. And you said the demand for purification from a corpse contaminated was so great during the second temple. So this all has to do with purification of what? The temple?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as Christians, we I know as a pastor myself, we often think in terms of forgiveness. We have forgiveness of sins, and that's about as far as we go, which is understandable because we don't go to a temple each week. We don't go to provide an offering. But in the Old Testament, under that system, they in order to approach the temple, even walk up into the temple courts, you had to be what was known as being ritually pure. So there was a variety of ways where you could become ritually impure, and one of them, let's say that you were getting ready, in a couple weeks to go offer your sacrifice, at Passover or something like that. But yet you were there, and your dad died in your tent or in your house. Well, when your dad died, of course, that's a natural thing, but you would become ritually impure, and so you were not qualified now to go and bring your offering to the temple. So God knew that, and so in Numbers 19, he provided a very inexpensive way so that people could regain their ritual purity, and that was with the ashes of the red heifer. You would go to the priest who had already burned the ashes of the red heifer. He burned the red heifer, he took the ashes, and he mixed them with water. So you'd go to the priest, and it took 7 days. On the first day, or you'd come in there and dedicate yourself, and then on the third day you'd get sprinkled, and you come back, and on the seventh day you'd be sprinkled. And so when you did that, now that ritual impurity that you gained from your father dying or walking over a grave or something like that is now removed. And so God says, okay, now you're able to come back into the temple area and offer your sacrifice, because God desired his people to approach him, but he also wanted them to always remember that he's holy, that he's pure, and so he gave them this other layer of understanding of ritual purity. And so I think it helped really solidify in their mind, again, this idea that when you approach God, you have got to have a purity about you. And so they were very serious about maintaining that. But of course, natural things happen, like a person dying, and God would say, if you do this procedure, you can regain it. And why God did all that, I guess we could probably speculate about a lot of things, but nevertheless, it does remind people, again, of God's holiness. And so for them, now that we don't follow that, we're under the new covenant, we don't think in those terms of ritual purity. But a Jewish person today who's living in the land of Israel, who's religious, for them, when they think about the coming temple, they know, hey, we cannot approach that without ourselves being sprinkled, and also so that you're sprinkling the people to get them ritually pure, because all of them have either been born in a hospital. They have different ways. Again, if you're born in a hospital, you're automatically declared unclean, because you could have a dead person there in the hospital. And so the fact that you're just in that hospital itself, you're unclean. And so today, they realize, if we're going to build the temple, so let me say it this way, they could build the temple today, potentially, hypothetically, they just could not use it because everybody's ritually impure. That's why they need the red heifer.
Now, chapter 3 of the book, page 29, you talk about, remember, these are exciting times. God is providentially allowing these events to come to pass in preparation for the arrival of the 7-year tribulation period. So let me ask you a question. Does the red heifer ritual that you're writing about, when this starts happening, and I don't know if they've actually started sacrificing them or not, I don't believe they have, but maybe you'll know, and once this happened, does this trigger something else to happen and other events to start happening?
So that's a good question. It has not happened yet. They had originally were hoping for Passover of 24, April of 24. The war with Hamas interrupted that, so they did not get to happen. But let's say that it did. If it did happen, what it would mean is they have the ashes, and they would have them there in storage, and they would have them ready to go. And then, in one sense, everything would be checked off for them to build the temple. At that moment, the only thing necessary or left or remaining would be Israeli governmental permission. And so that's what they're hoping for, is that one day they will be able to get permission from the Israeli government, and it would be politically expedient or peaceful enough for them to build it, which I think probably won't happen until this coming world ruler, this false Messiah, comes on the scene, because in Daniel 9:27 he says that he will make a covenant with the Jewish people for 7 years, and I think that covenant is the Mosaic covenant that he's going to allow, or he's going to cause to prevail over the land of Israel, which that's what they're waiting for. They're waiting for a figure to come along who will give them permission to rebuild the temple and to reestablish all the Mosaic law, which if you ask a Jewish person, again, what's the Messiah going to do? And they're going to say, well, the Messiah is going to bring back the law of Moses. He's going to cause it to prevail over all the land of Israel. That's what they're waiting for. And so with the red heifer, that would just be checked off. So could the red heifer let's say the red heifer was slaughtered, so let's say it was in last April. The temple being built still might be 5 years or 10 years or 20 years off, who knows? But they would just be waiting and waiting and waiting. And there's a few other things which I'm sure will come up in our conversation about what they're doing right now, even the current Israeli government, which we can talk about.
All right, well, folks, we are talking today with Mondo Gonzales from Prophecy Watchers. His book out right now, The Red Heifer Ritual, the last piece of the third temple puzzle. Stay with us, and we're going to have more right after this. This is Mark Taylor. If you miss a broadcast of Crosspoint, you can always go to our website at www.kneo.org and click on the programs page. There you can access the current Crosspoint program as well as the last 4 programs that have been aired. Never miss another Crosspoint program again. Go to www.kneo.org today. Welcome back to Crosspoint. I'm Mark Taylor. Your guest today is Mondo Gonzales. We're talking about the Red Heifer Ritual. Now, Mondo, if someone wanted to know more about this book, about Prophecy Watchers, where you're at, and also other books you've done as well, your ministry, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. If they go to prophecywatchers.com, we have the largest prophecy bookstore really in the world dedicated specifically to prophecy. They can check it out there, and they can get the Red Heifer book there at prophecywatchers.com.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you before we leave this subject, because I've heard this, and I just want to get your take on it. So you talked about they haven't actually done this yet, but they were planning to in April until the Hamas war broke out. And I had heard, from other people in the areas of prophecy that one of the things that helped push that Hamas movement was they was afraid that the Red Heifer ritual was going to start again, and they wanted to do something to try to prevent it. Is that true or false?
It's true in a sense, but it also has a certain level of propaganda to it because, as we know, Hamas doesn't need a reason to kill Jewish people. And the reason why it came up is, the attack that they did was on October 7th. They didn't mention anything about the Red Heifers. They had never mentioned anything about the Red Heifers ever publicly before that. But once Israel started their war to remove Hamas, obviously things weren't going well. And then in January, one of the Hamas leaders made a public declaration, and he gave many reasons for why they attacked. But one of the reasons, that, at least in his statement, in addition to others, was bringing in of the red cows. So that was the first time where they made a public statement about the red heifers coming to Israel as being a cause for their attack. So, in looking at it, I think it was just, again, a propaganda for them to bring it in because it was convenient at that time to try to justify their actions. But, again, unfortunately, they had never said anything about that prior. But there is no doubt, I will say this. So in all the interviews that I did with people who were in Israel, in November, December, they were talking about they were talking about this ceremony that was going to happen between Passover and Shavuot, the Feast of Shavuot, which is basically April 22nd to June 12th. So they had this window, and there was nothing specifically special about this window. Those are just when the spring feasts happen in Israel, and so the Temple Institute was wanting to have it at that time because, again, it's a very special time for those celebrations. But they had, in November and December, they were working, and they had tentative permission from the Israeli government to perform the ceremony. Well, then, as we know, Hamas came out with this comment in January, and then, of course, that the Israeli government was getting pressure from the United States government about their war in Gaza and threatening them if they didn't, calm it down, they weren't going to get weapons and stuff like that. So the Israeli government had a change of tune because they didn't want to allow the ceremony to take place which could have been interpreted by the U.S. government of them throwing fuel on the fire, because Hamas had just come out and said what they said. So what Hamas did there, it was actually a brilliant strategy, because of that now it gained the attention of the American administration. And so the tentative approval that these groups had to perform the ceremony on the Mount of Olives was now rescinded. One of the guys told me specifically, who said, yeah, Mondo, we're planning on it. And later when I talked to him, he said, look, we're not allowed to talk publicly about the ceremony any longer because of the war. And the Israeli government felt that they were in an existential war in many ways, and so they weren't going to allow that to be put off course by a Jewish religious ceremony that, for the most part, most of the Israeli society doesn't care about. And so you did see a very massive change in the perspective of the Israeli government at that time, and that's still the status quo today.
Well, over on page 45 of the book, you talk about there was a belief that has become quite common among religious Jews. They believe the time of the Messiah arrival is close. You said this belief is very important because if a red heifer does come and is slaughtered, the mindset of the religious Jews will be very eager to receive someone as the Messiah. You also say it seems quite clear that the religious Jews will accept the Antichrist as their Messiah. What are you trying to kind of tell us here?
What I'm saying there is that you have in the land of Israel, again, that 80% secular and 20% religious, the fact that they have been looking for red heifers really for 40 years, or at least hoping since 1967. I mean, that's a long time. And one of the medieval sages, so to speak, a Jewish sage by the name of Maimonides, really about the 12th century, he wrote a document called the Mishnah Torah, which again is part of the Jewish tradition. And what he said, he talked about the red heifers in that, and he said he listed them all out. There have been 9 red heifers in history from the time of Moses all the way till the 1st century. And he made a comment that when the 10th red heifer comes, that it will be offered up by the Messiah himself. And what the Jews today think is they don't necessarily go that far to say that the Messiah has to be here to be the one to officiate at the ceremony. But what they have said is the fact that we are living in the time when there is 5 qualified, well, now there's 2, but there was a preliminary 5 qualified red heifers. They realize even if these don't work, there's others in the wings, which reveals to us that we are living in the time of the arrival of the Messiah. And so what it's doing is it's shaping their mindset, because they haven't had this level of excitement or even opportunity in 2,000 years as it relates to the red heifer. So the fact that there's all these red heifers going around makes them really makes them ripe, so to speak, for a Antichrist figure to come along and to provide that permission for the Mosaic Law and the temple services to be reinstituted. So they are very ready. All these things are pointing to them that we are ready for the Messiah to show up. He could be here any day.
Now, when you say they're very ready, there's other pieces of the puzzle that have to go, because you say that here in the book, that this is a piece of the puzzle. So is all the other pieces there? I mean, everything they need to make this happen?
As it relates to the third temple, yes. All of the other things are done. I mean, they even have the stones. They have them being built at other locations. And each year, they try to bring up the cornerstone. They put it on a truck, and they try to drive up on the Temple Mount and to put it in there, just even as a ceremony. But the police always turn them around and say, no, you're not coming up here. You don't have permission, because they know that would start a bigger war than what's going on now. But there's going to come a point in the future where this Antichrist figure, whoever or wherever he comes from specifically, he will have the authority to cause Moses and the temple to be rebuilt. And that's what they're waiting for. And so, apart from the red heifer, they have everything except this political permission. When the red heifer happens, that's the last piece. We're almost there on that. But once that happens, there'll be nothing left except political permission.
Now, one of the other areas that I guess is about this, page 62 of the book, you talk about one of the ceremonial aspects of the red heifer ritual slaughter involves children. The children are put on the animals. They're led to the pool of Siloam. And so you talk about how they get this water, they bring it up, but you say there at the last today, this group of children who were born in the complex, which is only built on bedrock. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is a fascinating thing because, as Christians, this is very foreign to us. As I mentioned earlier, we don't think about ritual purity, but the Jewish people have, and so not only the children, but for a Jewish person, if you walk on the ground, like if you're out here walking on the grass, hypothetically there could be a grave there. It's just an unmarked grave. Therefore, if you walk on the grass, you're considered ritually impure. But they know that nobody can be buried under bedrock. So if you walk on bedrock, then you are not deemed ritually impure because you're on bedrock. There's no contamination of a dead person there. The other way that they do it is if you walked on a deck or a platform or a raised platform and you weren't actually touching the ground, as long as there's air, usually on a deck, if you build a wooden deck in your backyard, there's air between the deck surface and the ground. So what they've been doing is they will have these children, and they have many young priests who are not born in a hospital, and they are raised in these compounds which are either built directly on bedrock or they're on raised platforms. And so these children grow up in these areas never touching the ground ever, never being born in a hospital, never being around a dead person of any kind. So you have a select group of people who, now you have some of these priests who are 17, 18, 19 years old who are now able to be priests. And so they can actually officiate at the ceremony, and they're being trained right now, not only the children to collect the water from the pool of Siloam, but also these young males to actually perform the ceremony, but they've never been born in a hospital, and they've never touched the ground with their feet. It's pretty amazing the level of commitment that these Jewish groups have in order to fulfill the commandment.
Looking at page 79 of the book, talking about Paul tells us when this time arrives, all the remaining Jewish people will be saved, and you're talking about, after this has been instituted and stuff, reinstituted, I guess is the word. We know that this event is going to happen at the end of the tribulation period. In the meantime, God's going to allow them to see their fruitless efforts of the Red Heifer and the rebuilding of the third temple in order for them to understand how spiritually lost they are. So this is a spiritually religious type of a deal, but it's not. It's really going to lead up to a more spiritual type of a deal, I guess.
Yeah, what you see, the 70th week of Daniel, which it's often called from Daniel 9:24 through 27, specifically Daniel 9:27, you have this one final 7-year period where you have the religious Jews instituting Moses again and the sacrifices. But what we know is that in the middle of the week, that in 2 Thessalonians 2, we get this insight that Paul describes the Antichrist coming into this new built temple. Who knows how long it's been there? It could have been there a year, 2 years, 3 years, or even just a few weeks. We see that's a snapshot. All we have as a snapshot is that in the middle of the tribulation period, 3.5 years in, the temple's there, and we don't know how long it's been there. But could it be there for the first 3.5? Possibly. But what we know is that the Antichrist comes in and declares himself to be God, which the Jewish people reject. They believe in one God in that regard, and so for them the Messiah can't be God, which is one of the reasons why they reject Jesus as well. We see in Matthew 24:15 that Jesus describes this as the abomination of desolation, and at that point, when he declares himself to be God, the Jews obviously reject him, and then we know from Jesus in Matthew 24 as well as Revelation 12 that the Antichrist turns on the Jews, and he begins a process of genocide against the Jewish people to kill all of them. That's why Jesus said, when you see this happen and you're living in the land of Judah, don't even go back and get your coat. Get out of town, flee as fast as you can, because this begins what is known as the Great Tribulation. And so what happens during that last 3.5 years is they are fleeing for their lives, they're being persecuted and killed, but there's a remnant that ends up getting saved. And by the end of the tribulation, we're talking at the very end of the 7 years, they have come to put their faith and trust in Jesus as the Messiah. Jesus said this in Matthew 23, verse 37 to 39. He says, "Look, your house is left to you desolate. You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" So at the end of the tribulation, they call upon Jesus as they finally received him as Messiah, and they call upon him to rescue them, and he does.
Now, again, tell people how they can find out more about, this book, The Red Heifer Ritual, and all the books you have, all the stuff you do there at Prophecy Watchers.
Yeah, if people go to prophecywatchers.com, they can just go to the bookstore there, or they can just type in my name, and you'll see all the books that we have there, and especially the Red Heifer book. I've done some other presentations on it as well, and so there's a lot of material people can find there.
All right. Well, folks, stay with us, and we're going to be back with more in just a moment.
On purpose, with a purpose, for a purpose.
To get God's truths into their lives.
Share God's love with people who need encouragement.
You get the truth of God out there, and it resounds and it resonates.
91.7 The Word.
It does amazing things in people's lives.
You're listening to Crosspoint. I'm Mark Taylor, your host. My guest today, Mondo Gonzales. We're talking about the Red Heifer Ritual. Good discussion here. Now, Mondo, you had been talking about the government and having to get permission to actually do this ceremony with the red heifer and all that. But the government had at one time gave permission. Now they've kind of withdrawn that. So the government would have to have some type of a religious order and understand the history of all this to even allow it. Is this government that's currently in Israel, the leadership all the way down to everybody in the Knesset, whoever's in charge of this, are they able to get a grasp on the importance of this?
Well, this is amazing because this particular government in Israel, which has been quite tumultuous over the past few years, this right now they have 66 seats out of 120, and it is the most religious government in the history of Israel. So that's the fascinating part about it, is at this particular moment, of all the governments that you see in Israel, sometimes you'll see it be more towards the liberal left side, sometimes it's more centrist. Here you have it being very right and religious. So of all the governments that have ever existed, this government right now has the most religious understanding of the Third Temple movement. Again, not everyone in Israel wants the Third Temple. I would say 80% of the people don't. But with the religious makeup now, they are able to be very influential in the government of Israel, because Netanyahu knows in order to have a coalition government, he made agreements with the religious coalition, so to speak. So they are very familiar with what this is. And the National Security Minister, his name is Itamar Ben-Gvir, he has been very, very vocal and active in pushing the envelope as it relates to their access to the Temple Mount. He goes up there quite often just simply to show that he can. And that's what's changed, is he's trying to change the status quo, and he knows that he can do it a little bit at a time.
Now, in the book, you've also got where you've done some other interviews as well. I know you talked with Derek Gilbert from Skywatch TV, and also, just trying to actually kind of question and answer, because there's a lot of questions I'm sure that people have, but what about Christians? How do they get excited? Should they get excited about when they're hearing about the preparations for the Third Temple? Because I know Christians are going to view it somewhat differently than the Jewish rabbis do. But these preparations, what are they really indicators of? Is it that our time's short?
Yeah, that's a great way to say it in the sense of short and sweet, because it does reveal our time is short. I mean, when I asked all these different guys, I think I had about 12 or 15 different guys that I just asked them, because, I wanted the reader not only to get my viewpoint, which I certainly can offer, but I wanted them to see whether there was a consistency between myself and the other Bible prophecy teachers, which are most of their favorites. And so what I did ask was, should we be excited about it? Because in one sense, we're not excited about the tribulation period, because that's a horrible time. Jesus said it's the worst time in the history of creation. So we're not excited about that. We're not excited about the Jewish people getting deceived by the Antichrist. We're not excited about those things. But the fact that we see these events lining up right now in front of us that haven't happened in 2,000 years, the exciting thing about it is that it shows that the time is short, and that we know that if the tribulation's coming, which is horrible, we know that Jesus is coming on the backside of that to fix the world. And that is exciting. And so we're excited for what it portends as it relates to the final conclusion of this stage of human history, when the Lord Jesus gets to come back and be crowned king, as he so rightly deserves.
On page 103 of the book, I believe you've got something there from Amir Safari. You're talking about instead of trying to guess how close the rapture is, why don't we, use these events to pray for the veil to be lifted up from the substance to be recognized that Israel is about to go through the biggest deception, followed by the more horrible Holocaust than ever before. So when you talk about the veil be lifted up, what are we talking about? That the scales, that from that scripture, the scales be removed from their eyes, that people will recognize that Jesus Christ is their Messiah?
Amir has been very careful in his writings. He kind of gets upset when Christians are maybe giving money towards the third temple or stuff like that, because there are some that do. And what he's describing is, hey, instead of giving money or encouraging the building of the third temple, which he's an Israeli, so instead of doing that, which is going to deceive his brothers and sisters, he says we should be praying that they get saved now so that they can be part of the church and they can believe in Jesus now, which I think that even those that would be supporting the temple, I do think their first and foremost goal would be to see all Jewish people get saved now, rather than having to go through the tribulation period. And so I think, he's reacting a little bit to it, but he sees the other side, where he lives in Israel. He sees the blindness of his brothers and sisters and relatives and family and everything else, friends and neighbors. Mm-hmm. And so his heart is to see the Jewish people come to have the veils, the scales lifted, which is exactly what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3. When they read the Old Testament, they have scales on their eyes because they're not reading them through the Jesus narrative. And so that's what Amir's hoping for.
Yeah, and that reminds me, when I was over there with the Christian Embassy, when we'd be out talking and you'd be talking about stuff people here in the States were talking about, and then they would kind of stop sometime and said, hey, you really need to think about this, what you're saying, because we have to live it over here. We have to experience over here. And so what you're saying is really, not too good for us. And we have to look at this a different way than what you're saying from the state side. So I can understand that for sure. Now, I believe it's chapter 9 here of the book, and this is interesting too. We say here, make no mistake, when the modern religious Jews begin to offer sacrifices in the coming of the third temple, they will not be mixed with faith in the once and for all sacrifice of Jesus. This is why I believe that God will not honor their sacrifices, and in fact, the non-Messianic Jews today are not ignorant of the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Tell us about that. That's kind of an interesting thought to the whole part.
It is. It brings up the question about, when all of us, if you've been to Israel, maybe on television, you see maybe an Orthodox Jewish guy with his black hat and his long curly sideburns. He's there at the Western Wall praying, and whatever they're doing. The question always comes back to, well, is God the Father hearing their prayers? And so what I spent in that chapter is I said, look, we need to understand from a New Testament perspective that Jesus said in John 14:6, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. So all those prayers, all those activities, even if but when they begin sacrifices, none of those are mixed with faith in Jesus. And so the fact of the matter is, as Christians, we recognize from Jesus' own words that none of those prayers are being heard because they're not mixed with faith in Jesus, their Messiah. And that's a very sobering thought. And there's a lot of things in Scripture where Jesus says, look, if anybody rejects me, they reject the Father. You can't have a relationship with the Father except through Jesus. So when we see these actions taking place, and they certainly do reject Jesus, by Jesus' own words, they cannot have a relationship with the Father, which is what they're missing. And Paul said the same thing in Romans 9 and 10, that his heart was grieved that his physical brothers, his cousins, and by genetics, were lost. That they needed to be saved. And so oftentimes we might forget that for us, we know that the thing that, whether you're Jew or Gentile, doesn't matter. The only way you're saved is through Jesus. There is no other way of salvation. But so when the Jews do these things, we recognize, it's really sad because they're doing all of these religious efforts, but they're not going to get to the Father except through Jesus, which is why, again, the whole point of the tribulation period is that by the end of the 7 years, they're calling on the name of Jesus for their salvation, and he comes for them.
You do mention also in the book in 115, I'm trying to kind of figure out what you mean here so you can explain it. You say, what is the spiritual condition of national Israel today? And then you go about talking about national Israel. Are you talking about their spiritual condition of what they generally believe, this 80%, or the 20% that maybe are something else? But or are you talking about something different here?
Yeah, the reason I use national there is because if we look in the first century, in the book of Acts as an example, the national Israel, the nation of Israel, and primarily their leadership, they did not receive Jesus. In fact, they crucified him. But you had individuals like Peter and James and John and the 12 apostles and the women. They received Jesus. But there was not a national reception of Jesus. In fact, there was a national rejection of him. And so what the Bible often does, and I describe it in that chapter, is when the leadership in the nation of Israel does something and the leaders are bad, then God, sometimes, for example, they got judged and sent into Babylonian captivity. Well, they were believers. We know Daniel was a believer. We know Jeremiah was a believer, individuals. But the nation wasn't saved by the individuals. Because the leadership made that decision of rejection and rebellion against God, they went into the captivity. And it's the same way in the first century. Because the leaders, the national leaders, rejected Jesus, they ended up, their nation got destroyed in 70 A.D. And so what it's going to take is for the national leadership of Israel to receive Jesus and to declare him to be their Lord and Messiah. Now, you might have individuals that are saved, but until they do it at a national level by the leadership, they will not get national salvation. That's what I was meaning there.
Yeah. Now, chapter 10 of the book, right there at the start, you talk about there on the first page, 129. So how should we respond or be prepared now? Most important, we need to be continually equipped to answer and evangelize those around us to the prophetic signs that are happening in our present time. So how do we do that? What do you want people to be able to do? You want to encourage them to do when you hear, we hear people talking about this very thing here, this Red Heifer ritual.
I think that one of the reasons I wrote the book was there's no doubt it made national news in the land of Israel, even though it's primarily secular. It certainly made news in all the prophetic circles and different things. And actually, it made national news here in America because CBS News, just back in April, they did a video on this where they sent people there. And so what it does is I wrote the book in order to equip the Christian so that when they see this, for example, on CBS or other things, they know that this is being discussed on a national level or just at a popular level. And so my goal was to, number one, educate the Christian in understanding why this is important. Even it comes from the Bible, so it is biblical, but also all the way through all the current events, all the situations that are happening in the land of Israel today, how this is different than it was 50 years ago even, but also ultimately that we can respond in a way that's biblically accurate as it relates to the spiritual state of what I described there in national Israel, because Jesus told us in Mark 13:37, what I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. To be ready, to be watching. And that really is why, was to equip people so that we can have conversations about these things and to tell people, hey, look, guys, this is showing that the return of Jesus is coming soon. Now, I'm not saying it's next week, but it also shows us that the things that are happening now were not happening 50 years ago, 35 years ago, 20 years ago even. We are living in a very special time to see all these events come to play, and so it gives us a great opportunity to share the gospel, knowing again that the time is getting shorter and shorter every single week.
So do you think that Bible prophecy now, more than ever, is unfolding at a more, let's say, rapid race?
Oh, absolutely. I think when you look at all the different categories of Bible prophecy, the Third Temple movement is just one of them, and that was what I wrote about in this book. But when we talk about globalism or liberties or tyranny or cashless society, digital currency, all of them, we can see they're so aggressively moving forward. The Ezekiel 38 war with Russia, Iran, and Turkey, and yet we see those three getting together militarily and making pacts. Everywhere you look, all the different categories of prophecy are converging, unlike ever in history.
Well, Mondo, again, tell people how they can find out more about this Red Heifer ritual, the last piece of the Third Temple puzzle, other stuff you do there, Prophecy Watchers. How do people go about connecting with you?
Yeah, if they go to theprophecywatchers.com, especially we have a tab there that says where to find us or where to watch us. I mean, we're on television, we're on social media, we have a print magazine, We have a weekly podcast where we update everything. And then, of course, we have the bookstore where they can find the book, as well as I think we have over 3,000 other materials, resources in our book, all related to biblical prophecy by everybody's favorite teachers. We have the largest online prophecy store that exists. And so it's a great opportunity if people want to learn and grow. ProphecyWatchers.com.
All right. Well, thanks so much for taking time to be with us today on Crosspoint.
What a pleasure for me.
Good interview today, Mondo Gonzales. That story, the Red Heifer ritual that he wrote about here, Holy Bible, my other hand. Stories right there, and several different times it talks about the Red Heifer. You want to know the Bible, folks. You want to know stuff like this, too, where it points you to different things in the Bible, like this book Mondo wrote, but you want to know the Bible on the other hand, because it is the very inspired words of God. Those stories about the Red Heifer and other stuff are there for a reason to help us today, believe it or not. So remember, the Bible's the inspired words of God. It's never outdated. It contains the most important words you're ever going to read and certainly ever follow. Be sure and join us again next time as we again discuss issues that are affecting the church. Have a great week, and allow God to use you for His purposes so that greater things can be done. Make your life count in God's plans for eternity. I'm Mark Taylor.
Crosspoint is a program produced in Studio 101 at KNEO Radio. Not all of the views on Crosspoint reflect those of the management or staff of KNEO. You may contact the Crosspoint program at 10827 Highway 86 East, Neosho, Missouri 64850, or by email crosspoint@kneo.org. You can hear Crosspoint 4 times a week: Saturday morning at 1, Saturday afternoon at 2, Saturday evening at 9, and Sunday evening at 7. You can also listen anytime online at kneo.org.